I'm going to ask Norm if he would lead us in prayer, and then we're going to be in both Lesson 18, finishing up some from last week, and Lesson 19 today. So, thank you, Jesse, for covering for me last week. We were with some of the boys up in Gatlinburg at the Chapman Highway congregation Sunday morning. So thanks for covering. I understand that Jesse had a lot to catch up for me on Lesson 17, but managed to get partially into Lesson 18. Today we're going to get into Lesson 19. There's a lot of these smaller stories that we may not be as familiar with in the larger overarching narrative of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. So we'll touch on some of those and see what lessons we can learn. Just to introduce why we're doing this, we study the Old Testament for a purpose, right? Romans 15:4 is a passage we quote often. What does it say? What's the reason why these things were written? Learning, instruction, what else? I knew Jesse could quote it for me. I didn't have to turn there. Say it again, Jesse.
Through the patience or perseverance of the Scriptures, we might have hope.
Right. Patience, perseverance, that we might have hope, right? How do you get hope from the patience and the perseverance that we've been seeing in these stories?
Yeah. Well, you can see that when people are obedient and faithful to God, He blesses them. So that's a lesson for us. If we are obedient and faithful, we'll be blessed too.
That's right.
That's a hope for us.
Yeah.
And you can overcome things that appear terrible to start with, but because we can see the whole picture with the Bible, we can see the end of the story and see how things work out, which is a great hope for us.
Yeah, like it says in Hebrews, all these died in faith, having not received the promises. Come on in, folks. All these died in faith, having not received the promises. And so we too are pressing on toward the end, and we all know that it's appointed for all to die once, and then comes the judgment. And we're planning to die in faith, faithful until death. And that promise that we're hoping for is after death, when God will save us from our sins. And so we get the same hope that they had. Were these perfect people? No, we're seeing that especially this week. Just almost goes patriarch by patriarch on sinful things that they did, and shows us that these were not always faithful men, but they did believe the promise that God had given, that they were to stay in this land, and that this land would be given to them, and that all the nations of the earth would be blessed through them. So one question that I think you guys finished on last week was related to Dinah. Who was Dinah?
She was the daughter of Leah, right?
She was the daughter of Leah. Anything to add, Francis? Okay, so she's the only daughter that's mentioned of Jacob, and she was through Leah. And so we see this story. It's all of chapter 34, where it says that Dinah, the daughter of Leah, verse 1, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to visit the daughters of the land. And we know that it turns into a tragic event. Verse 2, when Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her, he took her and lay with her by force. And it wasn't just a passing rape, it was now an infatuation, right? He goes on to be deeply attracted to her, verse 3, and seeks marriage to her, right? I asked the question, and I have a reason why I asked this question I'll share in a minute, but is there any suggestion in the text that Dinah brought it upon herself? I see some heads shaking. Norm?
In the idea that she was out probably somewhere where it wasn't the best influence, to that extent, we are all responsible for what happens to us, consequences of our actions. That does not necessarily mean that we're we're responsible for what somebody else does to us,
No.
which could be evil or good, but it certainly, we have to consider things like, where am I? Where am I going? What kind of people are there? And teach that to our kids too.
Right. Yeah, she may have been naive, right? She's the only daughter mentioned. Maybe she's looking for some other females to have as friends. And so she's going out, but we know that the instruction that's been given for generations now was to not intermingle with the people of the land, right? And so there's that maybe unwise choice. But the reason I asked the question is Bonnie was given a 13-lesson book to teach to the young ladies a couple quarters ago, and she comes across a lesson, and it's all about how girls need to be careful, or they might end up getting compromised, raped, and things like that if you behave like Dinah behaved. And it was stretching this text a little bit, as I think a lot, because that's all it's mentioned, is that she went out to visit the daughters of the land. Doesn't say she dressed immodestly, right? Doesn't say that she was hanging out in the bars or, just living in a way that would suggest that she's interested in that sort of thing, right? So it just doesn't say that. So we should be careful not to stretch God's word. Those are good lessons to teach our daughters, but we got to be careful not to take a passage that simply doesn't say something and make it say something. So that's just something good to remember. Sad what happens to Dinah. And, of course, who is it that chooses to avenge her?
Her brothers.
It is her brothers, right? The two who are specifically named are which two?
Levi is one of them.
Levi and
Simeon.
Simeon. Levi and Simeon. So two of those, I guess it goes Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah. So the second and third sons. Her full-blood brothers, the other daughters, or other sons of Leah. So what was Jacob's reaction? Of course, if we remember the story, Shechem, the young prince of the city of Shechem, I'm sure named after him, he comes and wants to marry her. The father is asking for her hand in marriage, and they act in deceit. I noticed that word in chapter 34. Verse 13, but Jacob's sons answered Shechem and his father Hamor with deceit. Have we seen that before? Seems to run in the family. We're just going to deceive others and act like it's okay. Obviously, God's not pleased with deceit. But their scheme is everybody needs to be circumcised, and then you can have our sister. But it wasn't just you can have our sister. What else was being suggested by the men of Shechem?
Share everything else.
You see some covetousness on their part. I don't think they really had Jacob's family's best interest in mind, because as they say down in verse 23, will not their livestock and their property and all their animals be ours? Only let us consent to them and they will live with us. So this was an effort to take what Jacob had. But the specific thing that they were suggesting was intermarriage, right? Verse 9, intermarry with us. Give your daughters to us and take our daughters for yourselves. What's the problem with that suggestion? They were uncircumcised, of course. But even if they were, and they became circumcised, but they were not God's chosen people. And God wanted to keep his people separate.
There's something else, too, that they usurped their father's authority here. They were the ones doing the negotiating for the family here without Jacob's knowledge in there. And that's you can see them going way too far right from the very beginning here.
Yeah, you got some presumptuous sons. They're not checking with their father. They're certainly not checking with God, which we don't see a lot of that in these generations of the early patriarchs going to God for what should we do, right? So Jacob's reaction, of course, they slaughter Shechem, and loot the city. After they're in the pain of their circumcision, they kill every male, take all the women and the children and all of the spoils. What is Jacob's reaction?
Well, the reverberations that are going to take place maybe throughout the land towards them, you made me obnoxious to all the inhabitants, and they're going to kill me, and they're going to wipe out our household.
Yeah, my verse 30, chapter 34, verse 30, New American Standard says, "You've brought trouble on me by making me odious among the inhabitants of the land." Does anybody have a different word? Obnoxious is the New King James. Okay. Obnoxious, right? Yeah. It's just this idea that people are going to despise me. And so you see the wisdom of generations there, where the young are probably a little more hot-headed and eager for revenge. The old are thinking about the broader repercussions of our actions. Should Jacob have done nothing? What would be the appropriate response? No?
Well, it's interesting that his response is delayed, let's say, because we're going to talk later on about the blessings that come up, and there's repercussions that come, and it's God's repercussions. It's not Jacob, even though he was very upset. He's letting God. Let God's judgment take place.
Sure. And we know from Romans 15 that Romans 13, I should say, governments bear the sword of God. And so there is sometimes God's judgment enacted through the law of men. And so perhaps there was, legal process they could have pursued. Of course, this man's father could have been told what he had done, and that man should have been held to account. You're going to see this problem all on down through the Bible story. What did David do when his daughter was raped? Nothing. He just ignored it. And it caused all kinds of turmoil in his family with Amnon and Absalom. And so this reminds me of that, because the sons, verse 31, are saying, should he treat our sister as a harlot? Something should have been done. There's a natural craving in man for justice. And thanks be to God that he is just. And we have a just God where all will be made right in the end, but also that we would pursue justice here on earth. Yeah, Norm?
Yeah, and it's an interesting characteristic of the patriarchs as it goes through, that one of the things that always causes bad outcomes is parents not taking action with their children when action needs to be taken. We see that all through, like you said, David. You see it through the patriarchs here. When people get out of line, the patriarchs are not taking action against their children, and the children are the worse for it as a result, and the whole situation gets bad.
Right. Yeah, leadership is needed, and we know this is the age of the patriarchs. There would come the time of the Mosaic Law where they can appeal to that. But here, why aren't these patriarchs providing better leadership? All right, so question 5, we talked a little bit about the intermarriage. So had they just intermarried with these people, what would we have? You wouldn't have a distinct people of God. And he wants his people to remain pure, to be a special people, a chosen race, right? Separated from the people of the land. All right. So Jacob in chapter 35, he is told to go to Bethel. And what happened to him in Bethel once before?
Stairway to heaven.
The stairway to heaven, that's right. Maybe that's where that image comes from. And so the idea of Jacob's ladder had occurred there, and that's why he called it Bethel, which means what? house of God. He thought this must be the house of God, and so he calls it Bethel. That was when he was on his way to Laban's, right? He was fleeing from his brother, and he lies down and has that vision. Now he's returned. He's returned to the land, and God says, chapter 35, verse 1, "Arise, go up to Bethel, and live there." And he tells him to make an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau. I'll skip question 6 for today. But how does God complete the circle of Jacob's journey from Bethel when he returns there? And he talks about how this is kind of Jacob coming full circle. No?
Well, we see really for the first time, the full promise is repeated back there. They've been getting bits and pieces to these, the patriarchs after Abraham that have not been quite up to, their faith has not been as strong as their grandfathers and great-grandfathers. But here we see in verse 11 and 12 the repeating of the entire promise, and we're getting more and more detail.
Yeah, that's right. You've got this repeat of the changing of Jacob's name, which happened, of course, when he's on his way back from the land, or from Paddan Aram. And verse 10, God said to him, "Your name is Jacob. You shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name." Thus he called him Israel. God also said, "I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come forth from you. The land which I gave to Abraham and Isaac, I will give it to you, and I will give the land to your descendants after you." So there's a repeating of these promises that were given to Abraham and Isaac to Jacob, and it's reconfirmed that here his name's being changed to Israel. He had received that name after what event? Rescuing of the angel. I think you guys spent some time on that last week. He had striven with God and prevailed, right? The angel dislocates his hip in order to get away, right? Could that angel have overpowered him? The angel that can kill 185,000 Assyrians? Of course it can. But God was giving him an image of striving with God and prevailing by his constant request for God to bless him, the source of all blessings. Going to God seeking blessings is something that God wants from us. So that's what Israel was doing. That's what Jacob was doing, prevailing in receiving a blessing from God. All right. Any other questions from that first part of chapter 35 in lesson 18? I asked you this question. Hopefully you gave it some thought. We don't have to share unless anyone would like to. How has the God of Bethel cared for you in your day of distress? That's what God says in verse 3. He says, verse 3 in chapter 35, verse 3, "Let us arise and go up to Bethel. Jacob says, I will make an altar there to God, who answered me in the day of my distress and has been with me wherever I have gone." Don't Pete?
Well, it shows that as much as we venerate these men, Jacob, unlike his father Isaac even, was very much close to being just an idolater like everyone else. He just had this other God. And it wasn't until this point where God says, it's time for you to go to Bethel to bring into remembrance to what he had sworn to him. If you bring me back, then you will be my God. Because up until this point, he's got all the same gods as everyone else. And the idols that Rachel had gotten and everything, and it is at this point that he actually makes the decision to be faithful to God and not all these other things that they've been carrying along with them for decades now.
Yep, these foreign gods. It's always kind of in the background of the story that they're doing these things that God told them to do and bringing along foreign gods. And here it shows that he's got quite a few, and he gathers them up and it says he hides them under an oak, which was near Shechem. Almost destroying those things, but hiding them, hopefully never going back there. But yeah, a new commitment, right, to serving God and serving God alone. All right, so in Lesson 19, we've got a number of stories we run across here in the second half of chapter 35. We've seen the birth of 11 sons. So who's the 12th? Benjamin. And so we have this sad occasion where Rachel dies in childbirth. What were the other circumstances of her death?
Well, they were traveling.
That's right.
On a
Where were they headed?
I'm sorry.
Where were they headed? Bethlehem. Yeah, it's also called Ephrath. Sometimes you'll see those two words together, Bethlehem, Ephrathah. But yeah, they're headed to this place, verse 19 says, on their way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. So it's our first mention of a city that's going to have great significance, where the Christ will be born. Dad?
Wasn't there another Bethlehem? And that's why they were distinguishing
I
between the
don't
two?
know.
Seems to me I remember.
Yeah, find one, let us know.
Okay.
It could just be the two names of cities, right? Where just like Bethel, named by Jacob Bethel, but formerly it was known as Luz, and so they retained the two names. And so it says that she was. It said that she suffered severe labor, verse 16, and the comfort that the midwives provide to her is, do not fear, for you have another son. Remember when she named Joseph, what did she prophesy when she named Joseph? Remember what his name meant? She named Joseph, and in naming him, she implied that she was going to have another son, if you remember that. That was kind of the meaning of Joseph's name. And here, sure enough, she has another son, but it's the very last thing that she does. Verse 18, it says, and it came about as her soul was departing, for she died, that she named him Ben-Oni, but his father called him Benjamin. A similar name, right? Both starting with Ben. What was the meaning of her name?
Son of my sorrow.
Son of my sorrow. But Jacob called him what?
Son of my right.
Son of my right hand, right? Which implies this is a great blessing, the one that I'm going to keep close, right at my right hand, and obviously a favorite of his. We're going to see favoritism in the next part of the story. We're skipping over the story of Joseph's coat of many colors for this week. That's next week's lesson. And we're catching a few of these smaller stories in lesson 19. So, you see Jacob, of course, I'm sure sorry to lose his beloved wife Rachel, but he has a much more positive outlook having received this son. Question 2, what sin did Reuben commit? So now the firstborn son is listed as doing something he should not have.
He committed adultery with Bilhah.
Right. He took his father's concubine. Committing adultery, as Dad said. And who heard of it?
His father.
It says Israel heard of it. Doesn't say he did anything about it, there again. But it is interesting that this comes back up. So in Genesis 49, it's the end of the story. We'll be there hopefully by the end of the year, Lord willing, if we live that long. And the blessings on Jacob's sons refer back to some of the things that they've done. And that tells us why these little one-verse stories sometimes show up. Like, that's random. Why did they throw that in there? Well, this is part of the reason. Who'd like to read Genesis 49, verse 4? Norm?
Uncontrolled as water, you shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed, and then you defiled it, and he went up to my couch.
Can you read 3 and 4?
Sure.
Sorry, I should have started.
Reuben, you are my firstborn. my might and the beginning of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. But then uncontrolled as water, you shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed, and then you defiled it, and he went up to my couch.
Right. These blessings, as we know, the patriarchs, when they're blessing their sons, are prophetic in many ways. But he's not passing on that birthright to the firstborn son. And this is the reason that he cites, because he slept with Bilhah. Any questions or comments about that? Who is it that's going to be the one through whom the blessings come? Judah, that's right. We know that the Christ is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. So Reuben does not receive the blessing. Question 3. What should a Christian do to attain the peaceful epitaph that Isaac achieved? Let's notice that. Let's look at verses 22 through 29. Maybe I can get some of our college students to read for me. We'll start with Madison, verse 22. We'll take 2 verses apiece and go back to Mark and Tina if we need it, and we'll just read through 29. Chapter 35, 22.
And it happened, when Israel dwelt in that land, that Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard about it. Now the sons of Jacob were 12, and the sons of Leah were Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, and Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun.
The sons of Rachel were Joseph and Benjamin. The sons of Bilhah, Rachel's maidservant, were Dan and Naphtali.
And the sons of Zilpah, Leah's maidservant, were Gad and Asher. These were the sons of Jacob, who were born to him in Paddan Aram. And Jacob came to his father Isaac at Mamre, or Kirjath Arba, that is, Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac had dwelt.
Mark, you read 28, 29.
Now the days of Isaac were 180 years, and Isaac breathed his last, and he died and was gathered to his people, old and full of days, and his sons Esau and Jacob buried him.
Great, thank you. Lots of names and places in that list. But we do see the listing of the 12 tribes for the first time. What do you notice about the order?
They were by the wives.
By the wives, right? It's not the order that we memorize, because we tend to memorize them in the birth order that's given in the story. But here, he's got all 6 sons of Leah, followed by not the next chronologically, but then the 2 sons of Rachel, right? So those are considered, his full wives, and so their sons have some preeminence there. And then last of all, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah. But then we have the kind of, I called it the epitaph, the final statements about Isaac. Isaac had a shorter story than the other patriarchs. We don't hear as much about what he does in his days, but it was a peaceful life for the most part, aside from this turmoil that happened with Jacob and Esau. But that ends up resolving itself. Thankfully, where the two, when he dies at a ripe old age, they're both there to bury their father. And that's a peaceful moment. And we know that they made peace, and Esau chooses another place to live away from Jacob so that their families won't fight. And so they're at peace. What can we do? What can a Christian do to obtain that same peaceful end to our lives? Any thoughts on that?
Be willing to forgive those that might rub us the wrong way, so to speak.
Yeah, that's a good point. Isaac could have held a grudge against his son Jacob for deceiving him, even perhaps against Rebekah for her part in that, but he didn't let it tear up his home. Jacob and Esau show that willingness to forgive one another. Esau, really, the one who obviously gets, there's a negative story there about how he despised his birthright, but then he should also be praised as one who was willing to let it go later on, after some time had elapsed. What else? Any other thoughts? You didn't know?
Yeah.
This is pretty open-ended here. Could go any direction. April?
You know, striving to live at peace with those around you. The fact that we don't read of, you know, a lot of contention, you know, I think speaks a lot of how he must have lived with,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, you have the story about the wells, where it's like if somebody's quarreling over this well, he'll just move on and dig a new well. I think the overarching theme, not just in Isaac's life, but it's this reliance upon God. And we need to remember that. Our lives, you know, the days are long, but the years are short, right? For Isaac, he lives 180 years. We're not going to reach that number, I don't think. But that long period of time, he's just faithfully serving God and remembering the promises. And if we can live that life with that humble confidence in God, that he's going to fulfill his promises. And yeah, there may be these waves of trial that come in our lives, but we're going to endure that trial. We're going to get past it, and we're going to keep on serving God faithfully. Then we may find that we have a similar ending in our lives, a time of peace. Norm?
To me, like at the end of his life, he realized he was where he needed to be, where God wanted him. Certainly the promises, he moved to where God wanted him to go. God gave him this final completion of all these blessings that are going to get. So he has that hope there. He's with his family. I mean, it just gives you that feeling that he has a sense of peace and fulfillment as he's done his best for God, and now he's where he needs to be.
Mm-hmm. Right.
There's a lot of peace involved with
It's
that.
nice to have the commentary from Hebrews 11 to put onto this story, right? That these people were looking for a city whose builder and maker was God, right? And that's the mindset of the patriarch. We should have the same mindset. Question 4 gets to chapter 36. Chapter 36 is long. We won't make anybody read all these names because that would be difficult. But it's basically telling us, well, what happened to Esau. And in a book of Genesis, right, a book of beginnings, you can see the relevance. Now, if you're reading your daily devotion and your daily devotion is Genesis 36, you may wonder, what's God really wanting me to take away from this, right? But you put it in the context of the Bible, you can see why. Because there's these two branches of Isaac, and we want to see where do these things come from. So a couple of takeaways I think you can get from this chapter. What region did the Edomites choose to live? Starting with Esau. Mount Seir, and I apologize for not putting a map up this week, but Mount Seir is south of the Promised Land. It says the hill country of Seir. And so we're going to run across this people in the story of the Exodus because the Israelites have to come through this land to get to the Promised Land. And so they're going to continually be a problem for the Israelites. Oh, great. Thank you, Jesse. So you should have that in your mind from last week. I also, as you look through the names, anytime you see a genealogy, I look for names that ring a bell, right? And sometimes if you have chain references in your Bible, there will be a little A or B next to a name that tells you, oh, by the way, this guy was mentioned somewhere else in the Bible. What grandson of Esau was listed in verse 12 that does impact the descendants of Israel? Amalek, right? We're going to run across these Amalekites. What's the famous story where they're supposed to wipe out the Amalekites?
Saul.
Saul, that's right. So Saul does not wipe out the Amalekites like he should. So those are descendants, at least as we infer, unless there were two Amaleks, these descendants of Esau.
The Amalekites were a problem, or were a nation, I should say, back before this time. Do you remember reading that?
I'm sorry, I didn't look at that. That's something good to be aware of, yeah. And so there may be two peoples of Amalek. Okay. All right. Question 5. What poor choice does Judah make? So we're skipping ahead. We'll come back to chapter 37 next week. Chapter 38, you have a story about Judah. So we've seen a story about Reuben, Simeon, and Levi. Now, even Judah is going to make some poor choices. So verses 1 through 5 of chapter 38, we don't have time to read those, but what were his poor choices?
Married a Canaanite woman.
He married a Canaanite woman, so that's not something that his father would have wanted. What else?
Was there, the New American Standard doesn't talk about marriage. It just talks about him having the privileges of marriage with a Canaanite woman. But is there a version that has marriage in it?
So verse 2, Judah saw there was a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and took her and went into her. So yeah, that's I see your point there, right? Whether or not they were married or not. Francis?
New King James Version says he saw the daughter and she was Canaanite and that he married her.
Okay, that's where it was. Okay.
Yeah, I think that kind of in this day and age, that was kind of the implication of the I guess the consummation of marriage. And so she conceives and bore a son and named him Then she conceived again. She bears a son named Onan. And then she bears Shelah. But what was, and we'll get to the sons here in a minute. What do you notice about Judah's friendships here?
And he got involved with it because of his friendship with Hira, the Adulamite.
Right.
And that got him in there. That got him in the same kind of a situation that Dinah got the family in.
That's right. Dinah, Dinah. That's right. So they, this friendship with the world. What's the warning that we're given in 1 Corinthians 15:33? We probably all have this one memorized.
Evil companions corrupt good morals.
Evil companions corrupt good morals. That's the second part. What's the first part of the verse?
Do not be deceived.
Do not be deceived, which implies that we might think we're going to be okay. And so we've got to be reminded that bad company corrupts good morals. Just like those things that are clean, when they touch things that are unclean, does that unclean thing become clean? No, the clean thing becomes unclean by touching that dead body or that blood or whatever it is. That was the pattern God wanted to see. You go to unclean things and you yourself become unclean. And so same thing with these righteous men. They don't often make the unrighteous become righteous. In fact, they become less righteous and commit great sin. And so what happens to Judah's sons? Right, they were evil. So it says, it simply says, was evil, and so the Lord took his life. And then the command of God here before the law of Moses, but the same expectation was that his second-born should raise up a son for his brother who had died. And was Onan willing to do that? No. He's obviously in private with his brother's wife, and he's unwilling to give him a child because he knew it would not be his own. So a selfish mindset. God sees that and takes his life as well. Sometimes we have a hard time reconciling the God of the Old Testament with the God whom we serve in the New Testament. So I asked you this question to help you think about that. Is there any inconsistency in this action of God, killing these two boys, for their evil men, they were grown men, and the God that we read about, the God that we study and worship.
Fire is the first thing that came to my mind.
That's right. Yeah, so you do see God striking someone dead for their sins. How many of us would be here if God did that every time? Wouldn't be anybody here. And so, because all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, so he doesn't do this every time, but he does it sometimes. Where else do we see him striking a soul dead immediately?
Acts 12 with Herod.
Acts 12, yeah, Herod for his pride. That's a New Testament reference. Old Testament stories as well. You've got Nadab and Abihu, right? Kind of they're right at the beginning of the law of Moses and carrying out the commands of that law. So Ananias and Sapphira was at the beginning of the new law. Seems to be kind of the showing of God's severity to help a people recognize who it is that they're serving and how serious he is about their righteousness. And so here you have Judah in this kind of the beginning of this next generation of patriarchs, and his sons are wicked because he's intermingled with the people of the land, and he strikes them dead for their wickedness. This is not going to be permitted by God, this kind of wicked Canaanite behavior. Any other thoughts on that? Of course, the New Testament refers to the kindness and the severity of God, right? Romans chapter 11, that he will cut off his own people if they sin, and he will graft in another people if they have faith, right? If they have faith in him. And so we need to understand both aspects of the God whom we serve. If we have a caricature of God where he's just this pushover, and we can sin continuously and never be faithful to him, and on the judgment day he's just going to welcome us in, well, that's a false view. That's an incomplete view of the God who we serve. He expects us to be holy as he is holy. And yes, we need our sins forgiven because none of us will be perfect, but only by the blood of the Lamb. Norm?
It seems like it's not so much inconsistency but God uses physical examples to set examples and to set that difference. We know that sin has spiritual consequences afterwards, so God is not inconsistent at all as to the final judgment for people, even if they do not receive the physical consequences directly from God here. But we do see these examples in each dispensation of time, so we know that God is in fact consistent in the way he thinks about things.
That's right. So we'll have more to say about what happens with Tamar next week. But lesson 20, I'll have that by Wednesday night, and we'll be moving on to Joseph with his coat of many colors. So let's be studying on that.